Please make Gesho. May the sacred presence of the one who said he would abide in his teachings be our guide. May we follow his glorious example and tread with unfaltering steps this noble path, until we too shall attain enlightenment. All Buddhas throughout space and time, all honored ones, Bodhisattvas, Mahasattvas, wisdom beyond wisdom, Maha Prajna Paramita. Good evening. I still have such a body memory of starting a talk and saying good evening and hearing the whole group say good evening in response. And I'm pretty sure I've mentioned this more than once since COVID has kept us from meeting together, but it's still showing up, that physical oral acknowledgement. So what I'd like to talk about tonight is sort of a preparation for precept study, not so much getting into the granular aspects of it, because I know Shintai is going to talk about this more next week, but more of a big picture part of it. And so part of the other factor that's playing into this topic is just sort of working with precepts currently in the midst of these current events. And, you know, part of what I notice is more and more of a sense of a loss of social cohesion, of a society that is fracturing or splitting, taking sides. I was in a Zoom meeting, or a Zoom sort of get together for people of faith to discuss sort of what motivated them to become engaged in the Black Lives Matter movement. And this was a Zoom meeting with a bunch of people I didn't know very well. I was sort of trying it out to see what's what and who's who. And that meeting got Zoom bombed with somebody who came in and just started spewing a whole bunch of hate speech. And he was very quickly kicked out of the room, which we were all grateful for. And the facilitator of the discussion contacted me later and apologized for that. He was like, "I'm so sorry that happened. You know, next time we'll make sure that there's a waiting room or other measures put in place to keep out people who might just jump in and say inappropriate things." So this is all sort of been part of my experience in the last couple of months, especially the Zoom meeting last week. And more I have a sense of moral injury occurring on a social level, on a society-wide level. And I first encountered that term, moral injury, doing a training that was hosted by the VA it was both for clergy and for, I think, clergy and chaplains. And basically it was a one-day training, I think it was a one-day training on addressing moral injury in veterans. And so moral injury is often associated with PTSD, but it's not the same as PTSD. PTSD has more symptoms that need to be manifest in order for that particular diagnosis to come about. But moral injury is, I looked up a definition of it on the VA website, or how it's being used in that context. And it says it's a traumatic or unusually stressful circumstances. In traumatic or unusually stressful circumstances, people may perpetrate, fail to prevent, or witness events that contradict deeply held moral beliefs and expectations. When someone does something that goes against their beliefs, this is often referred to as an act of commission. And when they fail to do something in line with their beliefs, that's often referred to as an act of omission. Individuals may also experience betrayal from leadership, others in positions of power, or peers that can result in adverse outcomes. Moral injury is the distressing psychological, behavioral, social, and sometimes spiritual aftermath of exposure to such events. Moral injury can occur in response to acting or witnessing behaviors that go against an individual's values and moral beliefs. And so this is a definition or a phrase that comes up when I think about sort of not necessarily the details of current events, but the effect that our current socio-economical, political situation is having on people, especially given that we're already stressed out about the COVID pandemic. And so I really have this question of how do we regain our ability to function from a sense of spiritual well-being? And so that spiritual well-being then is a sense of place or purpose in the world, a sense of belonging or having a sense of meaning. And having a sense of spiritual well-being creates a sense of connection and community. So in this time where there seems to be or appears to be much more of a sense of divisiveness, separation, us against them mentality, then how do we regain our sense of connection and community? We're sort of privileged here because we have this Sangha, and I'll just put that out there as, you know, a place for spiritual grounding. So I want to read from The Perfection of Wisdom in 8,000 Lines. And this is an old scripture. It belongs to the collection of Buddhist literature called the Wisdom Sutras. And there are several versions, big and small. The Heart Sutra that we chant belongs to this collection. The Diamond Sutra belongs to this collection. This is this version of The Perfection of Wisdom in 8,000 Lines is translated by Edward Kanza. And there's a prose section and a verse section. And I'm going to read from the verse section, which is called the Ratnaguna Samkhayagata, which I just butchered the Sanskrit. Sorry about that. So I'm going to read from 3 different pages. And these all have to do with how bodhisattvas function, essentially. So, in this section called Where Bodhisattvas Stand, he does not stand in form, perception, or in feeling, in will or consciousness, in any skandha whatsoever. In Dharma's true nature alone is he standing. And that is his practice of wisdom, the highest perfection. Change and no change, suffering and ease, the self and not self, the lovely and repulsive, just one suchness and emptiness they are. And so he takes not his stand on the fruit which he won, which is threefold, that of an arhat, a single Buddha, a Buddha fully enlightened. The leader himself was not stationed in the realm which is free from conditions, nor in the things which are under conditions, but freely he wandered without a home. Just so, without a support or a basis, a bodhisattva is standing. A position devoid of a basis has that position been called by the Jina. And I love that piece. The leader himself, so speaking of the Buddha, was not stationed in the realm which is free from conditions. He didn't escape to a place where he wasn't in this realm of conditions, nor in the things which are under conditions, but freely he wandered without a home. That's such a beautiful way of expressing the liberation that comes through practice. Wherein bodhisattvas train. Those who wish to become the Sugata's disciples or Pratyeka Buddhas, or likewise kings of the Dharma, without resort to this patience, they cannot reach their respective goals. They move across, but their eyes are not on the other shore. Those who teach Dharma, and those who listen when it is being taught, those who have won the fruit of an arhat, a single Buddha, or a world savior, and their nirvana obtained by the wise and the learned, mere illusions, mere dreams. So has the Tathagata taught us. 4 kinds of persons are not alarmed by this teaching. Sons of the Jina skilled in the truths, saints unable to turn back, arhats free from defilements and taints, and rid of their doubts. Those whom good teachers mature are reckoned the 4th kind. Coursing thus, the wise and learned Bodhisattva trains not for arhatship, nor on the level of Pratyeka Buddhas. In the Buddha Dharma alone, he trains for the sake of all knowledge. So this section here is speaking to kinds of people who aren't afraid by emptiness, and aren't afraid of emptiness as it's taught in the Buddhist teachings. And that we're not seeking individual liberation, but we're aiming towards the Buddha Dharma as taught by the Buddha, training for the sake of all knowledge. All knowledge, sarva jnata, the Buddha's all knowledge is not as an encyclopedic knowledge, but more of a sense of having the capacity to respond appropriately, to know what is needed in the moment. So some of this language sounds a little funny when it's read in this translated verse, but there's a pattern to it that I just love deeply. How the Tathagata knows the world, the suchness of the world, the suchness of the arhats, the suchness of Pratyeka Buddhas, and the suchness of the jinas. Jina is another name or another epithet of the Buddha. As just one single suchness, free from existence, unaltering, has the perfection of wisdom been understood by the Tathagata. Whether the wise abide in the world or whether they have gone to final nirvana, firmly established remains this fixed sequence of dharmahood. Dharmas are empty. It is that suchness which the bodhisattvas understand. Therefore, then have the Buddhas been given the name of Tathagatas. This is the sphere of the guides with their own powers, who reside in the delightful forests of the perfection of wisdom. Although they fetch suffering beings out of the 3 places of woe, yet they never have anywhere the notion of a being. And then lastly, this section, how bodhisattvas help beings. Giving, morality, also patience and vigor, the concentrations in wisdom should be turned over into enlightenment. So those are the 6 paramitas that were just named. But one should not grab at enlightenment, having considered it as belonging to the skandhas. It is thus that it should be demonstrated to beginners. Coursing thus, the oceans of qualities, the moons of the doctrine, become the shelter of the world, its refuge and its place of rest, the means of salvation, the intelligence, the islands, leaders who desire its welfare. The light, the torch, teachers of the foremost Dharma, imperturbable, an armor difficult to wear, the greatly determined put on. But they are not armed with the skandhas, elements, or sense fields. They are free from the notion of the 3 vehicles and have not yet taken hold of it. They are irreversible, immovable, and steadfast in their character. Being thus endowed with Dharma, unimpeded, freed from hesitations, perplexity, and consternation, intent on what is beneficial. Having heard the perfection of wisdom, they do not despair. They should be known as incapable of being led astray by others, as irreversible. So that gives us a little bit of sutra to land in, to anchor in. That describes how bodhisattvas train. And so what do we even mean by bodhisattva? There's so many ways we can use that word. In the Avatamsaka Sutra, it renders the words bodhisattva as enlightening being. Not enlightened being, but enlightening being. There's something beautiful there that indicates there's a process happening. It's a present tense. We're on the path, we're making progress. And in Buddhism, I've encountered several different ways this path of practice is described, this path of a bodhisattva is described. And some say a bodhisattva gives up or puts off their own enlightenment until all beings can become enlightened. And there are others who say that what we should do is strive towards enlightenment, because it's only when we're enlightened that we can truly help others become enlightened. So one group is sort of reaching for enlightenment in order to help, and the other group says, like, we're going to help as best we can, even though we're not there yet, but there's an emphasis on us together. And Zen tends to use that first version, that we're setting aside our own enlightenment in order to benefit others. And we also take this sense that as enlightening beings, as awakening beings, enlightenment is not a moment or a state, or enlightenment is a moment or a state. It's not a, the way we experience it right now, it's not a final stage. So Shakyamuni Buddha's enlightenment is described very differently than how we talk about enlightening moments within our own practice, or moments of awakening. We get little glimpses of it. And yet at the same time, we recognize that there are times when we have these moments that change us and we can't go back. And I don't know if it's true for any of you, but I certainly know in my own practice, there have been surprising times, sometimes frightening times, when I've realized I can't go back. I can't go back to living my life the way I had previously. It's not a matter of choice anymore. It's just something has changed so fundamentally. So the Ratnaguna was talking about the 6 perfections. And it talks about the perfection of wisdom as the highest perfection. Wisdom in that big sense, that sarvajñata sense. And in those 6 perfections, the others are dana, shila, kusanti, virya, jhana, in addition to prajnaparamita. Those are generosity, morality, patience, vigor, concentration, with wisdom as the 6th. And so the precepts fall into this, under this category of shila, of morality. If you look at the Noble Eightfold Path in Buddhism, you know, the precepts will certainly show up under a number of those paths. Right livelihood, right action, right speech. Certainly they show up in all of those places. Buddhism often talks about wisdom and method, or wisdom and practice, prajna and upaya. And the main takeaway here is that the precepts are part of this perfection of morality. They fall under the method side or the practice side. In our practice, in our lineage, I often heard Kyogen talk about the importance of both samadhi power and karma relationships. And that's a beautiful way to look at this balance between concentration or meditation or wisdom and the way we manifest that, the way we manifest our dharma in the world, the way we show our character. So as we move towards our precept study, don't neglect meditation. It's an important part of this process. I've noticed in giving Dharma talks at Dharma Rain, Gakmyo, our abbot, will almost always talk about some function of mind, how mind functions, how mind works, where we get caught, obstacles, I tend to talk about behavior. I talk about view. I talk about manifestation of how we show up in the world. And in a way, you can take those two patterns, and they fit very nicely into this wisdom and method, or wisdom and practice. Gakmia talks about the wisdom side, I talk about the practice side, or the method side. So I think because of that, because I tend to move towards talking about practice, talking about the doing, talking about the action so often, I really want to remind all of us about the importance of the meditation side, the concentration side, the wisdom side. You know, if we have our wisdom without any sense of practice, we can have insight, but it can be a cold insight. It can be a cruel insight. It can be a nihilistic insight. And if we have that practice side without wisdom or without clarity, then we can act in ways that cause harm, or we can act in ways where we think we know what's good for someone else, which is probably not what we're aiming for. So returning to this sense of moral injury out in the world, or moral injury that we ourselves are experiencing in light of the economic situation and political situation, it's important to regain a sense of balance. It's important to return to our spiritual well-being and to notice where you feel a sense of community, whether it's this community, whether it's other communities, and lean into that refuge of Sangha. This refuge from the self, from the small self, in the places where you feel support. So as we lean into this, or start this precept practice, where we have our prohibitory precepts, do not kill, do not steal, do not misuse sexuality, we have the affirmative side as well. Cultivate and encourage life, honor the gifts not yet given, remain faithful in relationships. When we first start practice, that prohibitory side is very important. We need to stop doing the things that cause harm. But as we get established in practice, it's important to notice and celebrate that affirmative side as well. That when we look at what makes a healthy community, or a supportive community, where we can find that sense of spiritual well-being, those communities have those qualities of those affirming sides of the precepts. So practicing the precepts is a way of manifesting the Dharma in a healthy community, in a healthy way. It is functioning from that place of enlightened activity. So there's often a tendency to remind people to engage in self-care. That's something that I've been hearing a lot from people recently, is remember to take care of yourself, remember to rest, remember to go out into nature. But one thing we can do as well is to take care of each other. That in those places where we find our spiritual well-being, in community, remember to take care of each other. That's an important part. So that's what I've prepared for a talk. And we've got about 15 minutes for discussion or questions, or just comments and reflections. If you can, please feel free just to unmute yourself and ask away.
I have to say that this is very topical, obviously called for, and as far as the political situation is, it's like watching a moral injury in progress. And now the only thing that we're really allowed as a citizen is to vote, and that one thing that we can do is being threatened. Literally,
Yeah.
it will be of no meaning whatsoever.
It's a it's a tricky situation.
Yeah.
But one of the things that I really took home from that training with the VA chaplains was that how much moral injury is really a spiritual crisis, and to really engage people on that level of where do you find meaning, where do you find support, where do you reconnect with that which you value, how do you identify that which you value, and then how to work with the sense of betrayal, because a sense of betrayal is what underlines moral injury so much. And so when we lose trust or we lose faith in those who, in theory, are watching out for us, that is a fundamental injury. And it's a spiritual injury. Whether or not that spirituality has any sort of deity or creator God or even no God at all, it hurts in a very deep way. So my hope is that people will make use of those they do trust, whether it's the Dharma teachers here or in other communities, to speak to their own sense of how they're hurting.
Jyoshin, reading that you read at the beginning, and the beautiful phrase, freely he wandered without a home. Could you tie that for me to the rest of your talk?
One of the promises of Buddhism. So often people come to practice because they want to not suffer. Buddhism talks a lot about suffering and easing suffering, gaining release. But this aspect of not being separate from conditions, but not being caught in conditions, freely he wandered without a home, speaks to that place of spiritual freedom, of that sense of ease that Buddhism speaks towards. It's not a separate escape from the world. It's not a being completely caught by our emotions and flung around by them, but it's walking through the world without getting caught. And so when we practice the precepts, so this is where it ties in with the precept study and the rest of the talk, is that when we do this work of meditation, noticing insight, doing the precept practice, that gives us tools with which we can begin to walk freely through the world. And so notice those moments of freedom. Notice when you're functioning in accord with precepts and how different it feels from when you're caught by anger or frustration or blaming someone else or gossip. And notice that sticky, icky feeling that comes when you're not in alignment with the precepts. The beautiful thing about this practice is that it is so accessible. It is so accessible and so reachable and so doable. Yeah. But I can't do it for you. And that's the frustrating part about practice, is that each person has to do their own practice. And I can say all the words, and the sutras can say all the words, and there's even a part in that sutra earlier on than when I read that said, even if a Buddha says the word being for 1,000 kalpas, no being will come into existence, because it's just a word. Can't do it for somebody else.
Thank you.
I wanted to respond to, I really like the fact that you brought out the positive and the negative. So, I think of the precepts of don't do this and don't do that. And to remember that the precepts also include some very positive, loving, kind, generous things to do. And I forget about that sometimes, that I get caught in the don't do part. So thank you.
Yeah, so many in our culture, in our society, really struggle with a sense of shame. And I think that's something that we're all, to a certain extent, conditioned with as children, and then grow up with an internal voice that's like, rah, 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 you're not good enough. And so it's easy to grab onto that sense of don't do, don't do, don't do, don't do. And if you do, you're bad. And really the precepts aren't set up that way. So like once there's a sense of where unskillfulness arises, turning towards those positive aspects, here's something we can do. Here's something that we can do that is beneficial for ourselves and others. Here's a way to walk through the world that makes it easier for someone else, that makes it easier for ourselves. If I can walk through a day without indulging anger, then I'm more relaxed and the people around me are more relaxed.
So it may counteract a moral injury too, for myself and others, to focus on the positive.
I don't know that it would counteract directly, but it certainly nurtures that small self in such a way that the stings don't go as deep. And that trust begins to be built in a way where trust had been broken. Other thoughts?
I've been thinking lately about I think I'm going to butcher it, but it's part of the commentary from the Diamond Sutra that we studied last summer. I think it's Huineng who says something like, past and future thoughts can't be found. The present mind can't be found because it has no attributes. And then even after saying that you can't find it, he then says, by what means can it be seen? And about a week ago, I've been working with that for like a year, and I kept thinking that what Huineng is asking is, by what means can I see my own present mind? I think it was like one of our 5, I don't know, there's some class we had this summer about the 5 schools, and I thought, oh, maybe Huineng is pointing to, how do I manifest so that other people can grasp or have a direct experience of present mind, their own mind, our sense of interconnectedness. So Huineng's not asking like, how do I see it? He's saying, how do I show up in the world so that other people can see it?
I think there's multiple facets there, but you're bringing up interesting ones. Yeah.
Anyway, that's what your talk made me think of.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's great. Because it can be like there's this interesting intersection between, okay, we have all of these teachings of emptiness. We have all of these teachings about how the mind works. And all of these instructions to sit and sit and sit and sit and sit. And yet, we're still people. We still function in the world. We still have to do our laundry. We still have to go to the grocery store. We still have to sweep the temple. Like, all of that still happens. So, yeah, how we show up matters. Understanding our own small self and understanding how mind works is part of the equation, and how we function in the world is the other part of the equation. They directly affect each other. So if your behavior sucks, your mind's going to be unhappy. Just as if your mind is unhappy, your behavior is going to suck. Like, they directly affect each other. My language has gotten so clean over these last few years, I'm amazed. We have 3 more minutes. I have to say, I'm super excited to see all the people who are going to be facilitating discussions for this class series. Money, were you going to say something? I saw you unmute.
I just was going to say, I had to write down what you just said, how we show up matters. That's like a quotable quote.
Uh-oh.
I'm going to think about that because it just, as I sort of gear up to start working with the public again, and even now, I mean, I have to work with, we do work with the public a little bit, and it's kind of good practice, actually. Just, I notice, if I'm in a bad mood, then that affects the person I'm directly dealing with. I mean, I've seen it millions of times.
Yeah.
If I'm in a good mood, it affects them,
Yeah.
and vice versa.
Yeah, so then there's this great question of how do we be authentic, our authentic selves, and still recognize the impact that we have on each other.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe we just need to remember that our authentic self is pure, generous, wholesome, connected to everyone, everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
And when we remember that,
Remembering our own Buddha nature as well as the Buddha nature of the person that's we're talking to, interacting with, that we drive by on the street. Yay.
And the person whose political opinions we don't agree with.
That is true.
I wanted to add something to what Nancy said. I think you're right. It does help with healing moral injury when you find people who do what they believe, who believe what they do, and who are honest, are open, are genuine. It really does help. You're right about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. All right, I think that's a good place to stop for now. The universe is as the boundless sky, just as the lotus is not wetted by the water that surrounds it. The mind is immaculate and beyond the dust. Let us bow to the highest Lord. All Buddhas throughout space and time, all honored ones, bodhisattvas, mahasattvas, wisdom beyond wisdom, maha prajna paramita. Thank you all, and I look forward to seeing you all next week at the